Yesterday, we were reporting on new nuclear power capacity in this country, part of the government's energy strategy, while it also commissions more offshore wind power. With or without nuclear, we know that under plans to take fossil fuels out of our electricity, wind power is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting. But is there one snag here? We may be running out of wind. The thesis is that among the effects of climate change is a potential stilling of the air. Low wind events may become more common just when we need some stiff breezes. Paul Williams is Professor of Atmospheric Science in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading. Paul, thank you for joining us. Let us start with the last year, because that was a very still year, correct?
Yes, it was. And it might not seem like it because, I know there's an 80-mile-an-hour storm headed for the UK or parts of the UK this weekend. But that aside, it really hasn't been very windy over the past year or so. I've been looking at the data and the winds were 15% slower than normal across large parts of Europe for most of 2021. And in fact, the epicenter of this global stilling phenomenon seems to be Scotland, interestingly. And that's where the winds last July were only about half as strong as we would normally expect for a Scottish summer.
If you get a 15% reduction in wind speed, do you get a 15% reduction in the electricity you generate from a wind turbine?
Unfortunately, not. It's worse than that. There's a projection that in the long term, towards the end of this century, there could be a 10% drop. So that's the long-term trend in the wind speed. And that would imply much more than a 10% drop in wind energy. Actually, it's more like a 30% drop. And because there's a very non-linear relationship. It's cubic between the speed and the energy that we can extract. OK, well, you've kind of
slightly jumped to my next question, which was, let's talk about the long-term trend, because obviously you have windier years and less windier years. What is driving this idea that wind speeds may be slowing down? It's to do with temperatures at the poles, is that right?
There's a mix of phenomena taking place. I think part of the effect is just increasing urban development. The buildings that we put up act as barriers and they slow the wind down. But as you've suggested, there's also evidence that climate change is coming into the equation here. And the basic effect there is that it's warming faster in the Arctic than the tropics at ground level. And that's to do with melting ice. And that's weakening the north-south temperature difference. And that is what drives the wind. So that's the link there between the temperatures and climate change and the wind speeds.
And is this now accepted as happening, or is this a kind of vague hypothesis that we may have a global stilling, not just last year, but somewhat in the future as well?
Well, I think we've got a bit more digging to do before we find out exactly what was going on, especially last year. I suspect that was partly just normal year-to-year variability that had been particularly pronounced over the past 12 months. But there is good evidence for a long-term trend. We know from wind measurements that have been taken around the world over the past few decades, the global wind speeds have been slowing by around 1 mile an hour every 30 years. So it's not a large effect, but we expect it to increase. And the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has projected, with what it calls medium confidence, that wind speeds will drop by up to 10% in the summer months by the end of this century across large parts of Europe.
Gosh, really something to think about. Paul Williams there from University of Reading. Thank you for joining us. 13 minutes to 6 now, and last look at the PM headlines. Andrew.